The candles in the east drawing room of Grenville Park had been burning for 2 hours by the time Octavia arrived, and she had come in through the servant's door. That was the part she had not let herself think about too carefully before she did it. Slipping past the gatekeeper in the blue-gray dusk, her traveling cloak pulled close, her hair pinned under a plain bonnet, carrying the small valise that held everything she had left in the world. The letter in her coat pocket said she was Miss Ware, a lady's companion engaged through Whitmore's agency in London. The letter was forged, but it was very well forged, and the housekeeper, Mrs. Aldgate, who had replaced old Mrs. Tully sometime in the last year, had looked at it only briefly before handing Octavia a ring of lesser keys and telling her the companions' rooms were on the 3rd floor and supper was at 6. No one had recognized her. She had been gone 14 months, and she had changed. She was thinner than she had been at 23, and she wore plain gray wool and no jewels. And she had learned in 14 months of living very quietly in a borrowed cottage in Northumberland that a woman who looks like she is waiting for permission to exist is very easy to overlook. She had been excellent at existing lately. She had become, without meaning to, nearly invisible. Grenville Park had not changed. That was the thing she had not been prepared for. The hall was as she remembered it, the great staircase, the portrait of her father in his young colonel's uniform, the smell of beeswax and old stone that she had grown up breathing and had missed these past 14 months with a specific and physical ache. She had stood in the servants' passage for one moment too long, just breathing it in, and Mrs. Aldgate had passed behind her and said sharply that companions were expected in the blue sitting room by 6:45, and not to dawdle in the halls. Octavia had gone where she was directed. She was very good at that now, too. The party had been going for 3 days, and Octavia had spent those 3 days learning the rhythms of a house she had once run. She poured tea she was not offered. She fetched wraps. She sat near the door in every room and watched. She was looking for one thing, the leather portfolio her husband kept in the locked drawer of the study. She knew what was in it, because she had seen him put it there herself, on an afternoon 18 months ago, when he had thought she was resting. The marriage lines, the letter from her father's solicitor, the document that named her, Octavia Grenville, as the sole inheritor of the Grenville estate, to come into her inheritance on the date of her 25th birthday. Her birthday was 11 days away. She had not yet managed to be alone in the study. Lord Hadley Vaughan was a careful man, and careful men did not leave their studies unguarded, especially not when there was something in them worth guarding. So she watched, and she waited, and on the 3rd evening of the party, they all went in to dinner, and Octavia took her place at the lower end of the table with the other companions and the quieter guests. And she watched her husband work the room. She had married Hadley Vaughan 2 years ago in a private ceremony in Edinburgh at his insistence. He had been her guardian for the 2 years before that, appointed by her father's will when she was 21 and deemed by some obscure clause not yet ready to manage the estate alone. He had been charming about it. He had said he would step aside the moment she was ready. He had said the Edinburgh marriage was a formality to protect her, legally speaking, until she came of age in the truest sense. He had said a great many things in those first months that she had believed because she was young and alone and frightened, and he had a warm way of looking at people that made them feel selected. She had stopped believing them by the end of the first year. By the time he had arranged for her to go north, for her health, he had said, with that gentle, concerned expression she now recognized as a mask worn over something colder, she had understood, at a depth she had not yet put into words, that she had been managed. She had simply not known what to do about it. Then she had found the letter. It had come to the cottage by mistake, addressed to Hadley, forwarded from the park. His man had been careless with it, and Octavia had opened it before she thought, and what she read had taken her breath away. It was from a solicitor in Edinburgh. It addressed, in precise legal language, the question of what would become of the Grenville estate should the current Mrs. Vaughan predecease her husband or be deemed unfit to manage her affairs. The solicitor had outlined 3 scenarios. The second one had a note in Hadley's handwriting in the margin. It said, "The most efficient." Octavia had read that note 4 times before she burned the letter and sat very still for a long while. And then she had written to Whitmore's agency in London. The woman came in on Hadley's arm near the end of the fish course, which meant she had arrived late and been given a seat at the center of the table, where everyone could see her. She was beautiful in the way that filled a room, dark-haired, very pale, with a necklace of garnets that caught the candlelight and threw it back in warm pieces. Octavia did not know her, but she watched Hadley seat this woman and lean close to say something. And the woman laughed and touched his sleeve, and there was in the gesture a long familiarity, the ease of 2 people who had stopped performing for each other and had nothing left to hide. Octavia picked up her fork and set it down again. And then Hadley straightened and raised his glass and said, easily, warmly, to the table at large, that he wished to introduce someone very dear to him, the woman who had made Grenville Park a home again these past months. Miss Venetia Lyle, he said, the future mistress of this house. The table applauded. Someone said, how lovely. The woman with the garnets smiled and dipped her head. And Octavia sat at the lower end of the table in her plain gray wool, with her hands flat in her lap, and understood that the sentence had just been spoken in her own dining room, at her own dining table, under the portrait of her own father, and that no one at that table knew she was there. She fixed her face into something neutral. She had a great deal of practice at that. She did not let herself think about the word future. She did not let herself think about what it implied, what it would require, for the word future to be honest. She simply breathed evenly and watched the candlelight move on the water glasses, and held herself together by will alone. She thought no one was watching her. She was almost right. At the far end of the table, a man she had not paid particular attention to, tall, dark-coated, quiet, the kind of man who says little and notices a great deal, had not looked at Venetia Lyle or at Hadley Vaughan or at the applauding guests. From the moment Hadley spoke the words future mistress, the man at the far end of the table had been looking at Octavia. He had seen her hands go flat in her lap. He had seen the almost imperceptible pause before she fixed her expression. He had seen the slight controlled effort of her swallow, the way she looked at the water glass rather than at the couple at the center of the table, and the way she looked at it not because she intended to drink, but because she needed something to rest her eyes on. That was not going to give her away. He had seen all of this, and he had understood all of it, and he had not looked away. His name was Gervase Dunmore, though most people in this room would know him only as the Duke of Strelwick. He had come to Grenville Park at Vaughan's invitation, for reasons that had everything to do with a charitable trust and nothing to do with house parties. He was not a man who spent much time watching the companions' end of long dinner tables. He was generally watching someone of consequence. But he had noticed this woman the first evening, and he had been unable to explain it to himself since. She did not move like a companion. That was the simplest way he could put it. She was doing everything correctly, sitting quietly, speaking only when spoken to, effacing herself with the practiced ease of a woman accustomed to being background. But underneath all of it was something wrong, some quality of a person wearing a costume rather than living in their own skin. The house fit her differently than it fit the other companions. She knew where things were before she was told. She paused sometimes in doorways, just for a half-second, in a way that was not the hesitation of a stranger in an unfamiliar house, but something else. Something that looked, to a man trained to observe such things, almost like a person recognizing something they had not expected to see again. He had meant to speak to her. He had not yet found the moment. After dinner, he made his own quiet inquiries. He found the footman who had shown Miss Ware to her rooms on the first night, and he asked a few idle questions, and he came away with one piece of information that did not fit. Miss Ware had turned, without hesitation, toward the east wing, the private family rooms, before correcting herself and following the footman back the other way. The footman had noticed because the companion's corridor was in the opposite direction entirely. She had turned, without thinking, toward the rooms she knew. The opportunity came 2 mornings later, in the library. Octavia had come early, before the household was properly awake, because she needed to think, and the library had always been where she thought. It had her father's books in it. It had a chair by the window that she had sat in every winter morning of her childhood, watching the frost on the old elm, and she needed, for reasons she could not entirely explain to herself, to sit in it again. She heard his step before she saw him. She was on her feet and had a book in her hand before he reached the door. Reflex, habit, the constant performance of having a reason to be wherever she was. But the man who came in was not Hadley. It was the tall, dark-coated one from dinner. He looked at her. She looked at him. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then he said very quietly, "You knew where the fire irons were kept without looking." She opened her mouth to deny it, and he shook his head slightly, not unkindly. "I'm not asking you to explain yourself," he said. "I'm only telling you what I saw." She looked at him for a long moment. He had steady gray eyes and the kind of face that had clearly decided, sometime in its late 30s, that it was done performing patience and would simply be patient instead. He was not smiling. He was simply waiting. "I grew up here," she said. She had not meant to say it. It came out of her the way things come out, when a person has been holding them too long. He didn't flinch. He didn't press. He only said, "I thought it might be something like that." And Octavia, who had not told anyone the truth in 14 months, sat down in her father's chair by the window and told it to a stranger in 6 careful sentences, because he was the first person in 14 months who had looked at her as though what she said would matter. She told him about the Edinburgh marriage. She told him about the cottage. She told him about the letter with the margin note. She told him about the portfolio in the study and the 11 days that had become, while they were speaking, 9. He listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I sit on the board of the Grenville Estate Trust." She stared at him. "Your father established it," he said. "A protective trust to manage the estate in the event of various contingencies. I was asked to serve on it 4 years ago, and I agreed, and I have thought nothing of it since because there appeared to be no contingency requiring action." He paused. "I begin to think there is one now." Octavia's hands had gone cold. She pressed them together in her lap. "He will have thought of that," she said. "He is careful." "He is," said the Duke. "But a trust requires documentation, and documentation can be examined, and a man who has been managing a young woman's estate for 4 years will have left traces, even if he was careful. The question is whether we can find them in 9 days." "We," she said. He looked at her. "Yes," he said, "if you're willing." She had spent 14 months being sent places she did not choose to go, waiting for someone else to decide when she was well enough, or ready enough, or simply convenient enough. She sat in her father's chair, in her father's library, in the house she had grown up in, and she looked at this man who was offering not to rescue her, but to help her, and she said, "Tell me what you need." What followed was 10 days that Octavia would later have difficulty describing, because they were unlike anything she had lived through before. She was still Miss Ware. She still poured tea she was not offered and fetched wraps and sat near the door. But underneath that, quietly, something else was happening. The Duke of Strelwick was not a careless man. He did not make obvious moves. He arranged to review the estate ledgers in his capacity as trustee, perfectly unremarkable, a trustee examining accounts. He wrote 3 letters that Octavia never saw, but the results of which she watched arrive over the following days, each one subtly altering the landscape of what Hadley could do and when. He found, in a dry afternoon's reading of trust documents, a clause that Hadley had overlooked, a clause that required the trustee's co-signature on any transfer of assets in the 2 months surrounding the beneficiary's 25th birthday. "Without my signature," he told her quietly, "in the library again, nothing transfers. He cannot move the estate out of trust without me." She let out a breath she had been holding, she thought, for 9 months. "He will try something else," she said. "Yes," he agreed, "so we have to move first." The move she had not anticipated was her own. On the 8th day, Hadley called her into the sitting room, not as Miss Ware, the companion, but by her name. Someone had told him. She had known the risk when she walked in the door, and she had taken it anyway. And now he was sitting behind his desk with the easy, dangerous calm she recognized, and he was looking at her with the expression she had last seen through a carriage window, as she was driven north. "Octavia," he said, "you are not well. You know you are not well." The physicians in Northumberland agreed. "You have come here in a confusion and said things to people you should not have said, and I am sorry for it, but you must see that this is exactly the sort of episode that—" "I heard you," she said. He stopped. "I heard you," she said again, "in Edinburgh, before the ceremony. I was in the next room and the door was not latched, and I heard what you told your man of business. I didn't fully understand it then. I understand it now." Something shifted in his face. The warmth went out of it entirely. "No one will believe you," he said. "The Duke of Strelwick might," she said. The silence that followed was the kind that comes when a man realizes the floor is not where he thought it was. She stood. She had the marriage lines in her hand. She had found them the night before. In the 1 hour the study had been left unguarded. The lock turned with a hairpin and 20 minutes of patient, careful work. She laid the documents on the desk between them. "I am not unwell," she said. "I am, in fact, quite precisely myself, and this is my house. And you are going to remain here while I speak to my trustee, because the alternative is that I walk into that hall and tell every person in it exactly what I heard in Edinburgh, and then you may explain the margin note yourself." Hadley Vaughan looked at the marriage lines on the desk. He looked at her. He made the calculation she had hoped he would make, that a public scene was worse than a quiet legal loss, that she had the documents and the trustee and too many witnesses now to dispose of cleanly, that his best remaining option was silence. He sat very still. He said nothing, and Octavia walked to the door. The formalities took 3 weeks. There were solicitors, and a great deal of paper, and 2 very uncomfortable mornings in a barrister's chambers where Hadley's counsel attempted several approaches, all of which the Duke of Strelwick disposed of, with the precise, unhurried competence of a man who had been managing other people's complicated affairs for a very long time. On the day it was finally settled, the estate restored to her name, the trust dissolved in the proper manner, Hadley Vaughan departed from Grenville Park with his valise and a notably brief letter of reference. Octavia stood in the hall under her father's portrait and felt the strange, suspended sensation of a thing she had been bracing against for so long that its removal left her temporarily unsteady. His grace found her there. He had taken to finding her in the places she went to be quiet, with a courtesy that never pressed, a presence that never insisted. She had grown to trust it the way you trust weather that has been reliable for long enough. "It's over," she said. "The difficult part," he said, "yes." She looked up at the portrait. Her father had been 30 when it was painted. Young, slightly awkward in his uniform, eyes exactly the color of her own. She had always found it comforting. "I didn't know I could do it," she said. "Walk back in here and hold on long enough." "You did know," he said, "or you wouldn't have come." She considered that. It was probably true. She had known something, standing in the borrowed cottage with the burned letter, and the hairpin, and the Whitmore Agency letterhead in her hand. She had known she was not going to let it end the way it was pointed. She turned and looked at Gervase Dunmore. Not the Duke of Strelwick, not the trustee, but the man in the library who had said I thought it might be something like that and had waited without pushing for her to tell him the rest. "Thank you," she said, "for coming through the door when you did." "You would have found another way in," he said. "Possibly," she said, "but this one was better." He smiled at that, a slow, careful thing, the smile of a man who had not done it often enough and was slightly surprised each time it still worked. And Octavia, who had walked through her own servant's door with a forged letter and a hairpin 11 days before her deadline, and the quiet conviction that she was not simply going to disappear, smiled back. She was standing in the hall of her own house. Her name was her own again. The candles were lit. Her candles, in her hall, in the house where she had finally stopped waiting for permission to exist. It was, she thought, an entirely reasonable place to begin.